Canada. So we're talking about north of New York, right? Okay, keep that in mind. Well, in the fall of 1776, the British Navy advanced from Quebec. What would be the purpose of that? Ms. Stroman, what would be the purpose? Why would the British Navy advance from Quebec? Where are they advancing to? Where in New York? Go ahead. Well, they already left there, so where's Washington now? White Plains, right. Very good, my dear. They're advancing from Quebec with the goal to attack General Washington's Continental Army at White Plains, New York. They know they're there. So in the fall of 1776, the British Navy advances from Quebec with the goal to attack General Washington's Continental Army at White Plains, New York. Now, a victory over the Americans by the British Navy could finish them off once and for all and end the Revolutionary War. So here's a second attempt that the British are going to make to end this quickly by coming down from Quebec and crushing Washington at White Plains, New York. Now, the only thing that stood in the British Navy's way was Benedict Arnold, ironically, who was stationed at Fort Ticonderoga, which was located on Lake Champlain. So the only thing that's going to stand in the British Navy's way of sweeping down and engaging Washington and the Continental Army at White Plains, New York, will be Benedict Arnold, who is stationed at Fort Ticonderoga on Lake Champlain. Remember, that was the fort that the Green Mountain Boys took? Arnold and Ethan Allen? Well, what Arnold was doing is he was planning a naval blockade of Lake Champlain. Now, the European military has some weird traditions. You know, we talked about how they're going to march straight into fire. Well, one tradition that the European military had is they ceased all fighting during the winter. And it was getting close, right? We're talking about the fall of 1776. So this naval blockade that Arnold is planning on Lake Champlain was simply to keep the British Navy from advancing towards Washington troops before the fighting stopped for the winter. That was his goal. So Arnold plans this naval blockade of Lake Champlain because he knows the European military tradition of ceasing all fighting during winter is going to go into effect soon. And this naval blockade was to keep the British Navy from advancing towards Washington's troops before the fighting stopped for the winter. Now, Arnold wasn't in great shape. He's sitting there with no ships, doesn't have a ship to his name. He's got 800 volunteers. And those 800 volunteers build 15 ships in 3 months to use as a blockade. Now, you got to remember, this isn't like you get from point A to point B in 2 hours. This is, 1776. And this advance that's coming down from Quebec is not taking a day. You know what I'm saying? It takes time. So Arnold, knowing they're coming, takes those 800 volunteers and he builds 15 ships in 3 months. And their goal isn't to win a battle with the British. Their goal is to string out the fight and keep the enemy from advancing to General Washington, right? That's the idea behind it, okay? Because they're going to have a break in the action here when winter comes. Well, what Arnold did is he took those 15 ships, and I'm going to show you this on a video and you'll understand it better. Arnold took those 15 ships and he sailed them behind Valcour Island, which was located in Lake Champlain. And he simply waited in ambush for the British ships. So he builds these ships and he sneaks them around Valcour Island and hides them behind Valcour Island in Lake Champlain. And he waits for the British to come because they're making their way from the fall of 1776 down. Well, they finally arrived at noon on October 11th, 1776. The British Navy arrives from Quebec on October 11th, 1776. and the battle begins. Well, Arnold directed the American effort himself. He even fired guns himself at the British Navy. And by dusk, Arnold's fleet was battered, and he had lost 1/3 of his men, either killed or wounded, from noon until dusk. Okay, his fleet is battered. He's lost 1/3 of his men, either killed or wounded. And before he could be captured, Arnold himself slipped past British boats in the darkness of night. So, in essence, when this thing was over, Arnold lost over 30% of his men and every one of his ships, but he accomplished the following two goals that were crucial. So even though he lost the battle, including 30% of his men and all of his ships, he accomplished the two following things. Number one is he stalled the British Navy into what? Into winter, right? That was his goal. He stalled them into winter. So what did the British do because it was winter and they don't fight in the winter? They withdrew back to Quebec instead of advancing to Washington and White Plains. So he stalled them enough to have winter come, and they took off and went back to Quebec. Second thing he did is he saved his countrymen to fight another day and possibly preserve a victory for the Americans. So without Benedict Arnold's efforts here, kids, we probably get wiped out at White Plains and the Revolutionary War is over. Now I'm going to show you a real short video here, and this will explain what I'm talking about. So Emily, if you could, my dear, get the light for me and shut the door, that would be great. This should take just about the rest of the period. It should be about perfect. So follow this in your notes as you see what I was talking about there concerning this particular move by Benedict Arnold. Okay, let's get our papers in and quit snapping the 3-ring binders here when this starts. Now see if what I told you is true. Okay, here we go.
In the fall of 1776, the British were preparing an invasion from Canada to finish off the rebels. There was only one obstacle in their way: Benedict Arnold, still chafing from his defeat at Quebec. Arnold planned to mount a naval blockade of Lake Champlain. The lack of a navy didn't discourage him. Arnold simply built one.
Arnold knows to beat the British that year, all he has to do is keep them from getting to Ticonderoga. He doesn't have to beat them in battle. He just has to string it out and make it take time. So he starts the building race to get the warships on Lake Champlain.
In 3 months, Arnold built a fleet of 15 boats and recruited 800 men. The British met his challenge by adding 25 warships to their own fleet. Arnold sailed his makeshift navy behind Valcour Island and waited in ambush. At noon on October 11th, 1776, the British flotilla found him. And the battle began. Arnold fought with a fury. Lacking trained gunners, he aimed some of the cannons himself, even while directing the fray. By dusk, the American fleet was shattered. A third of Arnold's own crewmen were killed or wounded. All of his boats were damaged. The British anchored and prepared to finish off the Americans come morning. But in the morning, Arnold was not there. Carried on a light breeze, he slipped past the Royal fleet in the night. In the end, Arnold lost
Taylor
most of
and
his
Tristan,
boats,
you need
but
to
he
go move a
accomplished his
vehicle if you
mission.
would.
It was now too cold for the British to march south, and they withdrew to Canada. This year, there would be no invasion. Benedict Arnold had bought his countrymen another season to fight. 250 miles to the south.
Okay, hit the lights there, Emily. That give you kind of a little idea what happened, a little better vision. So Benedict Arnold, who ends up being treasonous, makes a huge contribution to the good of this country and the Revolution by keeping that British Navy from getting to White Plains, or we'd probably get strung up there. Now, we were in tough shape early, and you're going to notice during this lecture that we don't get on the offensive very quick. And when we do, we again get several unbelievable breaks and use great strategy to get ahead of the game. So anyway, that is what happened there. Tomorrow we will continue on with this particular lecture and tell you what's happening in the Revolutionary War.